Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Henry, and this week I'll be taking you guys step by step from how I used the SketchUp background and turned it into a beautiful 3D illustration. The first step into the drawing is always to create the canvas size I like to draw on. And for this drawing, I have created an 11 by 17 with 300 dpi, and that's the resolution of my file size. And the next step, I begin by bringing in the two SketchUp backgrounds I like to have as the base. One of them is the shadow layer, the monochromatic shadow layer, where I can use as a multiply on top of all my other layers to really give it that sense of depth. And the other one is really just used for tracing only, and this one I will turn off at the end of my work. And this, you can export it with line weights and materiality, so it reminds you basically where certain materials are. And then you can begin adjusting the opacity in the drawing just to get it to a place where you can kind of see the background, but it doesn't overwhelm you while you're tracing on top of it. By grouping the two SketchUp layers allows me to rescale and resize them into a smaller image on my canvas, so I can have a little bit of white space when I create this drawing border around it. Before I start the drawing, I like to pick the pen that I'm going to use for the rest of the drawing. And in this case, I picked a medium-sized pen, and I have 3 pen settings from small, medium to large, and they'll be useful for creating different size drawings or adding textures that requires smaller pen weight. Now the next step is to basically trace the architecture. In my opinion, this is the easiest step and the most mindless part of the drawing as well. You really just want to get the outline of the SketchUp model, and you don't have to do everything in detail at this point. Remember, just the outline. You could be watching a TV or listening to music as you do it. Depending on complexity of the drawing, it might take you very quickly to do this, or a little bit longer to trace out all the outlines. And we're gonna save this as a layer of its own, and we'll begin by adding additional details on new layers. So we always have this as, if you will, the bones of the drawing, and anything else you build on top of this. And the reason for that is this will always be the foundation of your composition, and if you change any other things like texture or fixture, you're not really erasing the background, and this allows you a lot of flexibility to quickly change things and designs. Once I have the basic architecture traced out, now it's time to adding a new layer, and we can begin adding further details on this layer. And the point here is any revisions that you need to do in the future can be changed without affecting the background architecture. The information you add on this layer can be a little different depending on what kind of drawing you're creating. For example, this drawing is fairly simple, so I could imagine adding all the details on this layer alone without having to add multiple layers in case I need to revise something. At any point in your drawing, you can always erase and revise things that you don't like. And I think this is the beauty of working digitally, is you don't have to wait until the end to revise things. You can do this anytime. You just need to find the right layer, which you drew the line, and start to revise things on that layer. At this point, the basic composition is done, in my opinion. I'm gonna adding another layer to do the patterns and materiality alone, because most likely and very frequently you're gonna need to change the patterns more so than the architecture, in my experience. So I want to do this as a separate layer, so when I do need to swap something out, I can just erase the content on this layer without affecting all the other layers. And this is just a really powerful non-destructive technique to draw very quickly and revise things as you go. And here I'm going to add a little bit of a steeple to give it a sense of texture to the wood paneling that's in place on the wall. And this is one of my favorite textures to do, because you always want to have a variety of drawing techniques, and this dotting thing that you see I'm working on is just a very simple way to show wood or anything that has a textured surface like plaster, things like that. So now the composition is mostly done and we're ready to begin coloring. But before I do that, I usually like to group all my pen work into a group in case I need to toggle this on and off, and also just to keep things pretty organized. And I'll begin coloring by creating a new layer and putting that layer behind the pen group. And the reason for this is since we are drawing in a transparent kind of a background, any color work that you put under the pen work will just show up. You don't actually need to color on top of the pen layer, and you'll find this a little bit useful later on. The idea behind coloring is color fast, and you can always erase if you colored outside of the border. Sorry, my head is kind of getting in the way, but I think you get the idea. Is you want to color everything within the container as best as you can, but not to worry if you go outside of it. I usually like to clean it up before I color the next step. So in here I will create a new layer to color all the wall paneling in wood, and this is just in case I need to change the floor texture into something else. I can just erase that floor texture independently of the wall coloring. So far the drawing is looking pretty flat and it doesn't have a sense of depth or shadow, and when you're drawing normally you want to draw things that are darker or in shadow with a different color, and since we've been coloring with the same color we don't really have that shadow. This is where that SketchUp background export with just a shadow with no line work will come very helpful, and it's kind of a hack. If you bring it all the way up to the top of the drawing and then set the blending mode to multiply, that will essentially give you the shadow that you need to really make this more have more depth into the drawing. And you'll see I've called it texture, which is actually incorrect. I meant to actually call it a shadow, but I am bringing in a new texture layer, and this texture layer actually looks more like a watercolor paper, and the point here is to use this watercolor paper, give the overall sense drawing just a little bit of texture in the color. And the magic here is to set this watercolor paper to blending mode called overlay, and this is gonna give you that little bit of texture so your digital drawing doesn't look so smooth. And this is so important when you look this like close up. I know it might be hard to tell from a recording, but this texture is visually it makes a huge difference. It makes your drawing from looking like a digital drawing into something that actually looked like it was made from the paper. And right now I'm just gonna erase some of the shadow background that I brought in because I decided to crop in the drawing before, and I don't really need to have this extended shadow outside of my frame. I think the great thing about working in Procreate is you don't have to do things linearly. You can do things out of order, back and forth, because editing just allows you to do that, as opposed to physical drawing where you have to really follow a process and a sequence. So here I've created a new layer, and I'm going to kind of just color all the glass portion of the house and call it out so it reads better for those areas. I'm not loving the color at this point. I think it's a little too saturated, and the wood is not really looking the color I wanted. I think it's looking a little bit red. And the great thing about working in Procreate is you can just select the color on that layer and then adjust the hue, brightness, or saturation if you have those colors setting. It's kind of like using the adjustment layer in Photoshop. So I'll do this for all the colors that I think is looking a little bit off. And this is basically the same technique I do with all my other illustration. I'm not so worried about using the exact right color initially because I know there's a lot of flexibility to customize it and adjust it post everything is done basically. Now the final part of this illustration is to adding your final touches, whether that is in pen or any color adjustments. You can do this when you have a little bit of time to sleep on the drawing a little bit, like do it the next day or rest your eyes for a couple of hours. You also see things a little differently when you had a time to chill out a little bit. And when you're ready, send this drawing out, and most likely whoever's reviewing this will have further comments. So that means you're gonna have to perform a little bit more editing in your design or your texture or your color. And if you have your Procreate layers set or created pretty smartly, this won't be a problem if you wanted to edit certain things, and will give you the flexibility to edit anything in the future. So that first image you saw in the beginning was actually edited based off sending off this drawing. The client had feedback and I edited it, and it wasn't really a big problem because I had all my layers set out differently, and I just had to do a little bit of erasing here and there. So hopefully I was able to help you out with a tip or two. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything else that you want me to shed more light on. Consider subscribing and hit that bell notification for future videos.